Good afternoon, this is Ms. Estes, and today we're going to add and subtract fractions with unlike denominators. Our I can statement is I can add and subtract fractions with unlike denominators. So if we take a look at the visual on the screen, it's asking what is 3/4 plus 1/6? So if we see we have 4 pieces to this circle and 3 of them have been shaded in, so that represents 3/4. And then our second circle, we have 6 pieces and 1 piece is shaded, so that represents 1/6. Well, if we want to add these two fractions, we have to make sure that the size of the parts are the same. We can't add fourths to 6 because their parts are different sizes. So we have to write each addend as an equivalent fraction with a common denominator. So if we look at our denominator, 4 and 6, we have to find a common multiple of these two numbers. Well, if we list our multiples of 4 and 6, 12 is our common multiple of these two denominators. So we can take both of these models and divide them into 12 equal parts. So if we look, once we do that, we see that 3/4 is then equivalent to 9/12, and then 1/6 is equivalent to 2/12. So now we have two fractions with the same size parts with the same denominator. So we can now find the sum and add 9/12 plus 2/12 to get a sum of 11/12. So there's just a couple of steps that we have to follow in order to make sure that we do that correctly. So our first step is to find the least common denominator. So if we look at this problem, we have 1/3 and 4/9. 3 and 9 are our denominators, and they are different. So we have to make sure we have the same denominator. So we want to find the least common denominator by listing the multiples of both of our denominators. So we have a list of our 3 multiples and a list of our 9 multiples. As you list your multiples, you're looking for the first number that they have in common. So as you see, the 9 is circled here because that is going to be the least common multiple. That's the first number that both denominators have in common. So then we have to find the least common denominator, which is the least common multiple. So sometimes you will hear the least common multiple be called the least common denominator because it's the smallest multiple both numbers have in common. So once we know that least common denominator, or sometimes it's called the LCD, or the least common multiple, the LCM, then we can make our equivalent fractions. So as you see, it's best to go ahead and stack your problem one on top of the other. So we have 1/3 and 4/9. So that way, right beside your fraction, you can write your equivalent fraction. So since 9 is your common denominator, you need to use multiplication to make equivalent fractions with a denominator of 9. So that's why it's important in 4th grade, we learned how to make those equivalent fractions. So our second addend, 4/9, we don't need to change this fraction because it already has a 9 in its denominator. So we can just leave 4/9 as is. Well, 1/3, we definitely have to make an equivalent fraction. So if we look at our denominators, we know that the denominator of our equivalent fraction is going to be 9. Well, 3 times 3 equals 9. Since we multiplied the denominator by 3, we do also have to multiply the numerator by 3, and 1 times 3 equals 3. So now we have the two fractions, 3/9 and 4/9. So we have two fractions with like denominators, so now we're able to add or subtract the fractions. So 3/9 plus 4/9. When we add fractions with like denominators, our denominator stays the same. So we keep that denominator of 9, and we add our numerators, 3 plus 4, and that equals 7. So this sum would equal 7/9. And then the very last step is to simplify or reduce your answer if possible. Well, looking at our answer, 7/9, I know that this cannot be reduced. 7 is a prime number, which means it only has 2 factors, 1 in itself, and 7 will not divide into 9 evenly. So 7/9 is going to be our final answer. So here's a graphic organizer that could also help you work your way through your adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators. And I like to call it the 4-square method because as you can see, it takes a big square, it divides it into 4 equal parts, and helps us go step by step through the problem. So the first thing we want to do in our first square is to write the problem. So say we're solving the problem 2/3 plus 3/5. So we want to write our problem first. So if we look at our denominators, yes, they are different denominators. And like we said, we cannot add them if we're dealing with different size parts. So we move to our second step is to find the least common denominator. So like we said before, when we find the least common denominator, we're going to write our denominators and we're going to need to find a common multiple. So we want to find the multiples of 3. So our multiples of 3 are what? Yep, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. And you can list the first 5 or 6 multiples and of each number, and then if you need to, you can always extend and add more multiples. So multiples of 5, 5, 10, 15. Oh, we're going to go ahead and stop there because if we take a look, we see that they both have 15 in common. So that lets us know that our common denominator is going to be 15. So our next step is to rename the fraction. And when we rename the fraction, we are just writing or making those equivalent fractions. So I'm going to take my original problem and I'm going to stack it one on top of the other so that way I can make my equivalent fractions right beside it. So we're going to make equivalent fractions with a denominator of 15 because that is our least common multiple or least common denominator. All right, so we're going to use our multiplication and we know that 3 times 5 is 15. So since we multiplied our denominator by 5, we want to make sure that we multiply our numerator by 5. And 2 times 5 equals 10. So 2/3 is equal to 10/15. So we're going to do the same thing with our second fraction. We know that 5 times 3 is 15. So since we multiplied our denominator by 3, we want to multiply our numerator by 3. And 3 times 3 equals 9. So now we have 2 fractions with like denominators. So we are now able to add these 2 fractions. So we add our numerators. 10 plus 9 equals 19. And then our denominator stays the same. So we keep it at 15. And so our very last step, step 4, is to simplify our answer. And what we mean is see if your answer can be written in a simpler form or reduced. Well, our answer is an improper fraction, so we usually do not keep our answer as an improper fraction, so we do want to go ahead and write this as a mixed number. So in our numerator 19, I know that we can make one group of 15. And if we remove that group of 15, we will have 4 left over. So 9/15 is the same as 1 4/15. And that's as simplified as it can get. There is not a common factor that we could divide 4 and 15 by to reduce it any smaller. So our final answer is 1 4/15. So guys, that's all we have to do in order to add or subtract our fractions with unlike denominators. And like I said, we have to make sure we have that common denominator. Sometimes it's called the LCD. Sometimes it's called the LCM because we're finding that least common multiple to help us make that new denominator. Rename your fraction by making your equivalent fractions. And then last step is to simplify your answer. Thanks, guys.